Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to the third meeting of the new Nordic ethnography. So we've had a couple of meetings before, one on welfare and one on the environment, and there will be a fourth one on diversity a bit later in the spring. So, welcome everybody. We have, apart from myself, who's going to chair this event, we have 4 speakers, and we've got an hour and a half altogether. So we'll be done by, well, 5:30 Central European time. It seems to me that it's appropriate that we speak about technology in the context of the Nordic countries, not only because the Nordics are enthusiastic early adopters, but also because technology perhaps plays a particular role in the Nordic countries. So what we're going to try to do this afternoon is to speak about, I think it's mainly going to be about information technology, information and communication technology, but possibly some other forms as well. To talk a little bit about the way in which society is being transformed through the adoption and the development of these technologies, which not least in the last year, we've noticed it in a very big way. We're having this meeting as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And a year and a half ago, we already had that opportunity, but we rarely took it to have these genuinely sort of international online live conversations, which has been one of the perks of the pandemic, I guess, that we've learned how to go about doing this. And it feels almost natural to speak on Zoom, which it didn't a year and a half ago. But so it's interesting in that respect. But the Nordic countries are also interesting in the sense that, Nokia was invented by the Finns, conquered the world in the 1990s. The Swedes have given us Skype and Spotify and various other applications that people use worldwide. And all of our countries seem to be moving towards a cash-free society, which indicates that there's a high level of trust and that the Nordic people seem to be less concerned with leaving electronic traces than others. My son studies in Switzerland and most of his friends are German. Because the Swiss are a bit like the Norwegians. So he makes lots of German friends, and nearly all of them have a bit of sellotape, bit of tape, which they've covered their camera on the laptop with, and he hadn't seen that before. And he had to ask, so why are you doing this? And they had to explain. So there's a certain enthusiasm, it seems, in the Nordic countries about new technologies, but also a lot of ambivalence. We are also part of the general worried discourse about artificial intelligence, about surveillance, and about brain pollution, the way in which our brains are being destroyed by our engagement with, especially the smartphone. So without any further ado, I think we should pass the floor to the panelists, and we have, Kelly and I have sent out, and Helena have sent out a few questions. You don't have to relate to those questions, but it's just a way of getting the conversation going. I suggest that each of you takes between 3 and 5 minutes. You can introduce yourself and your work, or you can relate to any of the questions, but it has to have something to do with the Nordic part of the world. I could be very democratic and say who wants to begin, but I don't think I'll do that. So I'll just move clockwise on my screen and start with Alexandra Middleton from Princeton, who's been working in, you might say, in the feminist STS, would that be correct? Neuroscience, medical anthropology, and you're currently working on the way in which embodied knowledge in technology enters into the home, and how the home becomes a site for, in fact, for the development of science, which is highly interesting, isn't it? The cybernetic man, and where is the boundary of the body? Where does it end? And where does everything else start? So I pass the floor to you, Alexandra. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tomas. Thanks for the introduction. It's a joy to be here with you all in virtual space. And yeah, so as Tomas said, I'm finishing my PhD at Princeton University, but I'm based in Sweden. And I conducted 2 years of fieldwork in the space of developing neuroprosthetic technologies. So I think, I'm not sure, but I might be the only one here representing the sort of more material biotechnology side of our conversation today, especially with questions of AI and brain-machine interfaces, and as Tomas spoke to, how embodied knowledge of actually carrying a machine and a technology integrated with the body creates new relations and new forms of knowledge. So what I did for my fieldwork was followed 2 clinical trials run out of Gothenburg, Sweden, out of Chalmers University of Technology and also Sahlgrenska University Hospital, in conjunction then with a private biotechnology company called Integrum. And the clinical trials were, they're still ongoing, engineering what's called neuromusculoskeletal prostheses. So throughout the world, there's several camps who are working on how do we integrate the logics of a prosthetic limb with the logics of the body. So not only to connect a limb to the body in a way that can be used mechanically, but also to use neurological signals to actually steer the prosthetic hand with thought, and then also currently working to get sensory feedback or touch into the body through the prosthesis. So these are highly integrated devices. So there's about six patients in the world, all located in Sweden today, who live with these prosthetics. And the prosthetics are integrated with the bone and the nerves and the muscles. And then the second clinical trial that I followed was a bit more, one could say, democratized or more sort of globalized technology to treat phantom limb pain, which many amputees experience as arising from the missing limb. And this used a lot of the same open source technology as the prosthesis. And it's a technology that reads the neuromuscular signals of the body to create a virtual limb in space. And so the individual uses this therapeutic technology to sort of rewire the brain through movement of a virtual limb. So I followed both of these clinical trials, and the neuroprosthetics one was situated solely in Sweden, and the phantom limb pain one involved 9 different countries. But the reason that I chose to situate my work in Sweden was twofold. I did want to step outside of the prosthetic history of in the United States, the sort of overdetermination of the coupling of the military with prosthetic science. And I wanted to consider how science in the social welfare state and biotechnology created a different set of values, or perhaps similar ones as well, about the laboring body, about restoration of the amputated body, and also concerned with how public science is involved with industry entanglements in biotechnology. So that was the one. And then the other, as Tomas spoke to, was the degree to which these technologies were moving into the home. So the patients in these clinical trials were living freely in their homes with these devices integrated with their bodies throughout the course of the clinical trial. So this was a really unique configuration of coming in and out of the laboratory and clinic while living in domestic life freely, unsupervised, and creating these sort of embodied relations, as well as improvisations that were perhaps not intended by the clinical trial itself. So as we heard from Keith in the first roundtable, the home is a very important site to pay attention to, especially in the anthropology of Scandinavia. And I really, so I spent a lot of my fieldwork time in the homes with the patients and observing how they built these sort of embodied relations, and then the maintenance and repair that went into being a experimental subject of a clinical trial all the while. So a lot of my questions have to do with how the home becomes an informal site of science in the making in the Nordic countries, and what sort of science becomes possible in the particular arrangements of experimental science in Scandinavia. So I'm sure we'll get more deeply into these questions, but that was just a short introduction.
I had to unmute myself. So thanks very much. Yes, I mean, there are lots of questions we could raise here, I think, not least to do with the peculiarities of the Nordic or Scandinavian countries regarding relationships to prosthetics and to the idea of being natural and the home and some other things. So we'll come back to that. But we'll then move quickly on to Alison Cool, who's got a very nice background. And you're at the University of Colorado at Boulder, right? At Boulder. And you've also been working in Sweden, but with a slightly different angle on data protection, surveillance, and that sort of concern. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for to Kelly for organizing us. And it's really nice to have a panel with so many people whose work I know and admire. So I like Ali, I have done research in Sweden, and I've done field work intermittently over the past 10 years or so, although I haven't been in Sweden in the past 3 years. But what my work looks at is how people use data and make decisions about data and establish relationships with data, primarily conceptualized as ethical relationships. So this has meant that I've done a lot of interviews with scientists working in different disciplines, people working in scientific data infrastructure, policymakers, lawyers, and activists, all of whom had some interest in either restricting the movement of data, for example, by promoting more privacy protections for personal data, or who wanted data to circulate more openly, either through open data initiatives and public repositories. So that's one part of it, is sort of like, how do people have these ethical relationships with data within the constraints of a changing Swedish and European legal system. And then the other part of it is really looking at the different histories of privacy that have led to this current moment where, so one of the questions we were given to consider was, why is it the case that concern with privacy and surveillance, it seems to be so much less in the Nordic countries than even in other European countries like in France or Germany. And so I'm trying to kind of trace the different histories of how privacy or personal integrity has been thought about in Swedish law and in social debates, as well as within international law. So efforts by the Council of Europe and the United Nations to promote what they thought of as a universal human right to privacy. And then a more American conception of privacy that enters largely with IBM and kind of the dominance of the American computer industry after the interesting but brief period of Sweden's robust computer industry in the 50s and 60s. So the questions are really about why people relate to data in particular ways, given their ethical understandings of themselves and data, and what it is that privacy means to people who do things in its name. So I'll stop.
Thanks a lot. I'm sure that later on some of the Swedes around here will have probably views on some of the things that you are raising, because there is something paradoxical about Sweden these days. On the one hand, I mean, are people unworried because they are trusting social democrats, or is it because they're reckless individualist neoliberals? Or maybe we can find a third way of speaking about this. Interesting subject anyway, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in what you're saying, it's a fascinating subject to look into, not least in a country like Sweden. Would have been interesting in Norway as well, but in a slightly different way. So we now move on to Alix Johnson, who's at the University of Florida, and you've got a very analog photo on your website. a nature photo from, I think it must be from Iceland, or at least some rugged, remote place, certainly not from Florida, with a lot of rock and waves and a bit of greenery. And you've been looking at the digital infrastructure, the material infrastructure in Iceland. So in a sense, there's a bridge here from your work to the previous meeting we had on the environment, where we spoke about the way in which in Iceland one uses geothermal energy these days to mine Bitcoin, for example. So Iceland is also a fascinating place in this respect. So the floor is yours.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you to all of you for being here today. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I completely agree that there's really important resonances across the two previous roundtables and the fourth one still coming. So hopefully we can kind of pull those out in our conversation as well. Yes, Alix Johnson, University of Florida. I'm also affiliated with the University of Iceland, which is where I am currently based this year. And my research is, as Thomas said, also based in Iceland, where I study digital infrastructures like data centers. Data centers are just facilities that process and store data, and fiber optic cables, right? Those communications cables that run under the sea. And I take those things as a lens on especially spatial politics. So my current book project that I'm very slowly finishing is about the relationship between data and place. And it asks how the data storage industry is being anchored in Iceland. On the one hand, socially, through ideas, for example, about whiteness, modernity, masculinity, and then on the other hand, materially, very materially through resource extraction, infrastructural history, colonial and military territorial traces. And then at the same time asking what kinds of effects these new infrastructures are having here. So all of this is based on somewhere between 20 and like infinity months of ethnographic research. Hard to say when it stops when you still live here, but mostly around data centers in Iceland. So there's a handful of these, but the majority of my research took place on the southwest coast, where a new cluster of data centers is being developed in the footprint of a former American Cold War military base. And so a big piece of what I'm interested in is tracing out kind of how these emplaced and embodied histories get perpetuated through the supposedly like ephemeral, diffuse information technology, and argue, of course, that they're in fact not. So I would say I'm especially interested in these kind of material and situated dimensions of data and information technology, especially here in Iceland, and then also increasingly across the broader Arctic. So there's a lot of these questions that I'm excited to dig into, but maybe I'll leave it there and we can pick it up.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much. I think you gave us some sort of keywords and key terms that we might want to discuss later on to do with, I mean, you spoke about the remnants of the American military base, how it's now being transformed into something else, and to what extent the digital technology is currently leading to comparable transformations also in the other Nordic countries. Which are wealthy, which are fairly well organized, and which invest a lot in digital infrastructure. What are the changes which will come about? Only earlier today, I was at a different conference, also with a few Swedish people and others, about the Arctic and mining in the Arctic, and the way in which people in some parts of the Arctic are now shifting from mining to tourism, which is a sort of a similar kind of or comparable kind of transition. So anyway. Yeah, now finally, Paula Uimonen, and we go a long way back, Paula. I mean, because Paula wrote a very pioneering PhD, I think about 20 years ago, under the supervision of Ulf Hannes on the internet in Southeast Asia. And it was so new at the time that there was hardly any anthropological literature around. So it was really a milestone in many ways. But you've also worked in other parts of the world afterwards. I mean, in African countries. And I believe you also have an interest in Sweden. So please, Paula, tell us what you want to tell us.
Okay, nice to see you all. And yes, I feel honored to be in this roundtable together with Thomas, who was my opponent for my PhD thesis at the time. There weren't that many anthropologists who could play that role either. And of course, my supervisor and forever intellectual mentor, Ulf Hannes, who I see there on the I've only seen on the screen for the last year. So thanks a lot for inviting me to be part of this new Nordic anthropology roundtable. And I guess I'll be I'm like the only Nordic panelist today. Yeah, since we're dealing with, with Nordic Anthropology carried out by American anthropologists. So that's interesting. So probably a lot more, you've done a lot more research on digital infrastructure and prosthetics or whatever in Sweden than I have, since my research has mostly been outside of Sweden, looking at digital media in terms of globalization, first in Southeast Asia and now in Africa. And I've become, I think, half African by now. I did, however, write something on the Me Too movement in Sweden a few years ago, and which is also related to, well, both Sweden's feminist policy and Sweden's feminist self-image of being a gender equal country, and then combined with the high levels of digitalization, which made the Me Too movement very, very pertinent in Sweden and very powerful, to the point where people speak about life before and after Me Too and all that. So I have also done a little bit of research in Sweden and worked with Nordic Museum and other memory institutions in Nordic countries on collecting visual digital heritage, mostly now photographs in social media as an object of our cultural heritage that's worth keeping by museums. So that's been interesting. But today I thought I would take this opportunity to I was inspired by some of the questions that you circulated in advance, and you said that we could make a little statement. So that's what I've been preparing. So my statement takes a slightly different approach here. Because the way I see it is that in these pandemic times that we're living in, Sweden's very positive attitude to digital technology has now become a kind of common social reality, since so many people are now living and working through the screen. But even from early on, Sweden jumped onto the digital bandwagon, aiming to be Europe's Silicon Valley, among other things, back in the days. And nowadays, it is taken for granted that almost everyone is online, and more government services are digitalized as a consequence. Now, I believe that this techno-utopianism, as you have called it, plays into Sweden's national self-image of being a modern, rational society, which put its faith into and even worships, if I may say that, science and technology as the pathway to societal progress. After all, what could be more rational than binary code, which is digital ones and zeros? But the pandemic has also revealed cracks in our system. So TV ads might show happy grandparents Zooming with their grandchildren, while in fact a great number of elderly people feel very depressed from their social isolation. And while a privileged middle class may feel a bit bored when working online from home, our lives are sustained by people who have no other option than to commute to their workplaces and interact with unknown people, thus putting themselves at great risk. So social stratification certainly plays out in the digital realm as well, following social markers like age, class, race, ethnicity, and gender. But such topics are rarely debated in public in Sweden. And that could perhaps be because they would disturb our self-image of being a digitalized modern people in a digitalized welfare state. Meanwhile, we have yet to see to what extent our digitalized lives can sustain our general well-being, since the pandemic is also showing us that humans are indeed social creatures with very social needs. So that's some of my reflections.
Well, that's great, Paula. Thanks very much. So I think we have a lot to talk about here, but maybe we could start by taking our cue from some of the things that Paula said about inequality and exclusion and, digital citizenship and so on, which does reproduce perhaps some patterns of inequality that existed before, but also reveals some new divisions. So, I mean, Alexandra, is the kind of technology that you speak of in the home, would it be available to everyone, or would it sort of reproduce forms of inequality that one didn't see before.
Absolutely. I'm glad this was introduced. Thank you, Paula. So when we talk about these neuroprosthetics, I think it's important to separate the clinical trials and the experimental process from the biomedical technology that's arching towards a global market. So the clinical trials are a proof of concept, and the hope is that then these will get approved in different markets and then become technologies. But the reality is that these are extremely expensive technologies that many countries cannot afford. And even to participate in the process of receiving these technologies requires a huge infrastructure of support that the state in Sweden provides for patient participants in the trial. So in terms of traveling from all parts of Sweden to Gothenburg for a handful of surgeons who are trained in these surgeries, nerve surgeries, and so paying for transportation, paying for hotel, paying for paid time off from work. So even to become a patient participant in this technology requires a high degree of sort of scaffolding of support that that citizenship in Sweden allows, but in many other medical contexts probably does not. That was part of the reason why the phantom limb technology, which is much less invasive, was sort of marketed more as like a more globally accessible technology, because it is much cheaper. It is not meant to replace the prosthetic, but to treat some of these some of the problems that arise with limb loss for patients. But I think it's important also to note, as Paula was highlighting, what citizens or what residents of Scandinavian countries get to participate in the first place. So when we talk about amputation and we talk about these prostheses are not compatible with congenital limb loss or diabetic limb loss. They're specifically for those who have lost a limb from traumatic injury. And when we think about amputees, it's a very small population in general. Then traumatic limb loss is an even smaller population. And then in Sweden, it's a much smaller population. But we have to remember that a large number of amputees in Sweden are actually refugees from war in Syria, in Somalia, traumatic limb loss that has occurred as a casualty of war. And so what I was very surprised by is that none of the patient participants in the trials were representing these populations. And so the questions come up of degrees of trust in the state, degrees of trust in the clinical apparatus, what sorts of bodies are these what sorts of lifestyles, what sorts of conceptions of the laboring body, of the war body, are embedded in the design of these technologies. And so the very small patient participants were all mid-40s, male, white Scandinavian. And so that raises a host of questions about what assumptions are embedded in the technologies themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. So why don't I, before I continue, if any of the other panelists want to just jump in, I mean, just raise your hand or raise your hand virtually, and I'll pass you the floor as soon as I can. So maybe I can just pass the question on to Alison. I mean, regarding privacy, protection of data, the kind of, trust in the system, that sort of thing, which varies even in Sweden. There are degrees of trust in the system. So have you come across any systematic differences regarding how people view these issues of surveillance and protection of privacy?
Yeah, so I think another group that I worked with included digital activists. And what one activist said to me was, is the question really that people don't care about privacy in Sweden, or is it just that it's so hard to care about privacy in Sweden? Because, and she told me about her efforts to have her blood sample deleted and thrown away from the PKU register, which is the register for all newborn babies, the small amount of blood that's taken from their heel to test for a rare but serious and very treatable disorder. And I had other people tell me, don't believe, another woman told me, don't believe the scientists who tell you that Sweden is going to go all bang if they don't get their hands on all of our data. So I think it is really important to note that there is a really wide range of perspectives on privacy, from maybe this kind of trust in the state to manage information in the best interest of citizens, like Paula said, in the interest of a rational and socially progressive world, and then others who are much more skeptical of that and who point to, look at Brexit, look at Trump. Everything's going really well until it's not, and then all your data is still there. But in terms of the way this developed historically with registration, if you look back at these records from the 1960s, especially, when automatic data processing was really being integrated into different ways of taking censuses, there were frequently these concerns expressed that there were some people who were really difficult to find. And that, not only do you have the registers of people who live in, this parish or that, but you also have registers of people who can't be found and people who don't have a known address. And discussions of these registers, and they were growing in the 1960s. All of a sudden, there's this huge concern about people moving around and not going and filling out their moving away card to let the parish office know that they were moving. And this was seen as a problem exclusively of foreigners, people who come to Sweden and don't obey the rules, and who move around without filing the proper paperwork. So, and you can even see the development of this, like going from a concern about, Finnish neighbors coming but they could still kind of deal with the forms, to, oh no, what do we do now when we have people from like Greece or Italy or Yugoslavia who can't even understand the forms? So I think there's a really long history to those kinds of exclusions.
Absolutely, I think we can all relate to that. I mean, a student of mine is looking at the introductory program for newly arrived refugees here, and obviously they have a hard time because everything is now Zoom and online, and they can't meet physically. But also just filling out the obligatory forms. She said, she's an ethnic Norwegian native and quite smart, and it took her several hours just to figure out how to fill in these forms. So that's another form of digital exclusion that I think we could talk a little bit more about, because being online, not only as a human right but also as a human duty, is now becoming pressing. At this university you can hardly park your car anymore if you don't have a smartphone, because you park it through an app. In the past, until last year, we had stickers that we put on our windscreen. Okay, those stickers no longer exist. So with no smartphone, sorry, leave your car at home. But Alix, if you can move to Iceland, because like Norway, Iceland has a scattered population. And I only read this morning in the newspaper that the last municipality in Norway which didn't have broadband is finally getting it. They're finally getting the fiber optic cables. And it's incredibly expensive to run this country compared to Denmark, for example, which is small and flat and fairly densely populated. Not so many mountains and fjords and glaciers, it's unbelievable. But they're now finally getting it, which they see as a major victory. And clearly this digital divide would also probably be articulated in Iceland as well, where there are some really remote places. Since you look at infrastructure, has that been part of your research?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. I'm happy to start there. And then I also wanted to briefly tack back to what Alison was talking about. But no, it's a good question. I think often when we talk about digital equity and the sort of so-called digital divide, what we're thinking about is access, right? Do people have the technology they can hold in their hand? Are people able to connect to the broadband, to the Wi-Fi? And, that's certainly a really important kind of terrain of discussion that I think other panelists have covered really well. And you know what? In Iceland, access is really good. It's really equitable. It's not perfect, but it's incredibly impressive what they've been able to do, even in remote regions, even in places that are relatively hard to access. I don't view that as maybe the primary kind of fallout around digital infrastructure today. What I'm more attentive to in my research are what are the kind of externalities, or what is the kind of underbelly of this digital technology that we've, as you put it, Tomas, earlier, that we've become so reliant on and so accustomed to. So, you know, my work looks at data centers, which are these just enormous, ugly warehouses. They're incredibly loud. They emit this hum that just like sets your teeth on edge and makes you want to jump off of something. They're ugly. They take up a lot of space. And so these things are not going in like the posh neighborhoods of Reykjavik. They're being sent out to towns in the countryside that have experienced this just incredible kind of loss and extraction and brain drain since, for example, the reorganization of the fishing industry in the 1990s, but also just more generally with the urbanization and draw of Reykjavik. These towns that have really been abandoned and really kind of left behind by the state are now becoming the kind of dumping grounds for big tech that wants to have a place where they can sort of hide their noisy, annoying problems. So I think in addition to asking sort of what's absent and who's missing, we might also look in terms of infrastructure to what is present and what is disruptive and who is it that's bearing the brunt of those effects. So in Iceland, again, sort of rural communities that have been in recent years largely ignored, and then also this region in Southwest Iceland that was really systematically drained by the American military for 50 years. Those are the places where digital industry actually fits in most seamlessly. Those are my thoughts on the first question, and you know, please steer us the direction you want to, but I was thinking in terms of what Alison answered. I'm wondering if we might spend a little time talking about privacy and surveillance in terms of COVID-19 specifically, since it sounds like so many of us are currently living in the Nordic countries, and I'm aware that you all are in Sweden and I'm the only one in Iceland, so maybe this will be a weird lopsided comparative exercise. But I've been really struck by the extent of digital surveillance in Iceland explicitly around COVID-19, the widespread acceptance of really invasive, to my eyes, digital surveillance here. And then at the same time, it hasn't been passively accepted. There are other forms of surveillance in relation to pandemic and quarantine that have been really contested, that have shown a great amount of, you know, contestation, if not distrust in government. And so I don't think it's a matter of, you know, oh, we just sort of passively accept surveillance here, but there are new lines being drawn around sort of who is watchable and who is not, and what are the fights that are worth taking up.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a history in Iceland around the Human Genome Project, where the genome of basically the Icelandic population was mapped out, and which was studied by the late Paul Rabinow, who just passed away, and Gisli Paulsson, whom I'm sure you know. And so maybe there's a higher awareness in Iceland of the risks of the state, or, you know, whichever actor is up there to know everything about you than in the other Nordic countries. But I wonder if we could just follow up the question of inequality a little bit more, because Paula, you had some very strong ideas about inequality in terms of the new digital divides. Do you think that the class structure is being altered as a result of the digitalization of work, society, etc.? We've seen it very clearly, as you mentioned yourself, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of us have secure jobs, we can work from home. We don't like communicating with students online, but it's okay, we can do it, you know, and nobody's going to fire us. Whereas others, they lose their jobs, or they're in insecure positions, or they have to go out and expose themselves to the virus every day because of their jobs. So what do you think? Does digitalization lead to new kinds of class differences that we haven't experienced before in this part of the world?
Well, I don't know if it leads to new ones, probably as well, but it's also kind of refies existing ones. And I think during the pandemic, what I find very interesting is how these differences have they've tried to conceal them. I mean, for me, the way I see it, the whole, like, the pandemic restrictions that we have also adapted even in Sweden, where it's been like, you know, more on a voluntary basis. Everybody plays their role as being a responsible, rational citizen. Kind of the basic idea rests on the idea of like the middle class, the educated white collar workers who can work from home, keep a social distance safely, who do not have to travel anywhere. And then like that becomes the model for how our society will get through this pandemic. And then at the same time, the facts have shown, like, for instance, there's been already differences between ethnic groups in who gets, who gets corona, where it spreads and who dies from it. Where, for instance, certain migrant groups have been worse affected. Again, it's like that example I used of the idea that old people the very elderly in Sweden are all like in great physical shape and they are super digitally savvy. I mean, it's, I think, a myth in many ways. Yes, there are some of those, but I know, for instance, my late mother couldn't even use a mobile phone.
Yeah,
so,
that's an interesting.
And those things are like, they're being concealed.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I'm sure that, you know, in a sense, the pandemic, I mean, it works as a kind of an X-ray machine or a magnifying glass, because it enables us, at least as social scientists, to see some of these divisions and hierarchies which have always been there, but which haven't been visible. And perhaps also, I think maybe we could talk about some of the emerging hierarchies, because I mean, in some of my own work, I've been looking at this dynamic between, you might say, overheating and cooling down. Overheating, you know, things happen really fast. And these are, you know, this is the epicenter of events. And then other places cool down. And there's always a dynamic relationship. So if someone overheats, something else cools down. In the mid-1900s, there were some industrial areas in Norway which were doing rather well because they were close to rivers. But then they didn't get the railway, you see. The railway went elsewhere. So they died out, and suddenly they were peripheral and marginal and left out and cooled down and abandoned and forgotten. And I'm just wondering if something similar happens now with digitalization. Think about the way in which people can now move and work. Working from home is probably going to be more common after the pandemic. That's my prediction anyway. So people can move to the Rocky Mountains or to upstate New York or to some cabin in the mountains here and do the job, whereas others can't. So I'm just thinking a bit along those lines. But since nobody has raised their hand to comment on this, we can move on to a related topic, namely, since Nordic people are famous for being enthusiastic, adopters of new technologies, not least in the realm of information technology, but also other forms of technology. With, I guess, Sweden as a driving force. You know, Sweden was to us, it was the America of our neighborhood, you know, when I grew up. It was so much more sophisticated and modern and rational and wealthy than Norway. They had everything. They had ABBA, Björn Borg, Volvo, Saab. We just had a lot of fish. You know, so we were looking up to Sweden. But all the Nordic countries, to some extent, have that role. So what are the main concerns? What are the main worries? If we don't worry about privacy, we don't worry about your smartphone addictions, because everybody seems to have one. What are the main concerns? Who wants to respond to that? What are people worried about regarding new technologies? Loss of jobs, alienation, loneliness? I don't know. Yes, please, Alison. I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I think there's this really enthusiastic early uptake of new technology, as you mentioned, but I find really interesting also that there's this really early enthusiastic uptake of the regulation of data in Sweden. So you have the world's first national data protection law in 1973 in Sweden. So how does that coexist with a place where supposedly there's so much trust in the state, and you wouldn't think there would be the need to impose this external framework to regulate what people are doing with data. And even if you look at like the Council of Europe and their efforts to coordinate regulation around privacy, Sweden was playing, and the Nordic countries were playing a really active role in that. And in fact, like in 1967, the first international conference on privacy law was held in Stockholm, organized by the Nordic Commission of Jurists. Although later it was revealed that the International Commission of Jurists was secretly, covertly funded by the CIA. So, I mean, there's all of these strange strands, and you keep seeing the Nordic countries at both extremes, like both enthusiastically taking it up and rapidly intervening to police the way it's being used.
Right, yeah. Anyone else wants to comment on this? What are people worried about regarding ICT? Yes, I mean, I see there are a couple of people in the audience now who want to come in. I suggest that I'd like to ask the panel just one final question, and then we'll move on to opening the floor for general comments and questions from the participants, which is to do with, I mean, one of the big questions that we are raising, not least in this part of the world, where we like to see ourselves as being a bit ahead of everybody else, okay? Namely to do with the green transition. To what extent do people see the new technologies as a means to transition towards a sustainable and ecologically responsible kind of society? Who wants to begin? Paula. Yeah.
Well, in that, since we believe that technology solves all problems, I mean, I've seen, especially during the pandemic, there's been a lot of hopes placed in that these virtual meetings, for instance, will reduce travel. And by reducing air travel, we will actually, you know, help the climate. So there is that hope.
Alexandra, I'm pointing. It doesn't help, does it?
Well, I wonder if Alex had a comment on your most recent question, Thomas, because I had a comment on what people are worried about. So Alex, if you want to take this first point.
Sure, thanks, Alexandra. Then we can get back to the previous question. Well, I can just chime in and offer a really pessimistic perspective here. You know, I think technologies are going to be absolutely essential in addressing and mitigating the climate crisis, and also just always want to point out how they are also contributing to it, right? The cloud, you know, the sort of conglomeration of infrastructures and industries that make up our digital lives now has a carbon footprint that is outpacing the commercial airlines, right? And it's only growing based on the amount of data that we continue to produce and consume. And so, you know, while I think there's a great faith, particularly in information and communication technologies, that we're going to innovate our way out of it, we're also kind of creating the problem as we solve it along the way. And so I think, you know, it's just a reminder to kind of disaggregate what we're talking about when we say technology, because I think that's maybe too broad of an object to be a kind of coherent actor in relationship to climate change.
Yeah, I've heard that argument too, you know, that Facebook servers, I mean, they use more energy than most airlines, but on the other hand, they're also used by more people. So it's more equitable in that sense, but the point is well taken, I think. Alexandra, please.
Thank you. So I think what all of us are gesturing to and around also is conceptions of temporality and futurity. And there was also a question circulated about techno-optimism in the Nordic countries as well as globally. And the question in my own field site that comes up is often questions of maintenance and repair. So we have these technologies that are functioning in a certain way, in my context, in the human body, but there's also this question of a biological time clock. How long do these materials hold in the human body? When do they have to be explanted and replaced? And I'm wondering if these sorts of questions that coexist alongside, obviously, this sort of cyborg imaginary, this notion of the human body being endlessly extended. I'm wondering how these, in the sort of embodied technology realm, relate perhaps to questions of surveillance or information technology as well. How do our systems that we have in place today age or evolve? So this is just a kind of floating to the rest of us to think with.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's these are some of the big questions. But we're now opening for some questions from the floor, and we have a couple of questions. I think Camelia, you were first, so please.
Hi, thank you. Good to see everyone, and thanks for your presentations. I think it's just so important what you're mentioning here about privacy and surveillance and how they're embedded in these technologies. And I was wondering if you wanted to share maybe your reflections or what you think might be a problem. Maybe this goes more towards Alison's work, but so in Sweden, now there's also this new authority for psychological defense that's been clubbed through and starting next year already. At the same time, they've just implemented new guidelines to defund media that spreads disinformation or vilseledande kring vetenskap in a country that has denied masks and asymptomatic transmission and so on. And this is also in this kind of rough context where, I mean, I'm a member of this private Facebook group that kind of got into this dold Facebook group, Informationspåverkan Spin, which is really unsettling, where Swedish public service, Vetenskapsradion, somehow infiltrated this private, secret or whatever Facebook group, and without informed consent, took various screenshots and kind of made this really weird propaganda show. So I'm just wondering, in this context, what are your thoughts about surveillance technologies and having an authority for psychological defense, whatever that means, and kind of taking control of the media narrative? Because in surveillance, how does that fit with democratic debate and being able to critique power and critique the state? What are your thoughts? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Camilla. It's a complex question. And there is something very Foucauldian about the entire situation, isn't there? I mean, in the sense that we seem to be trapped, and it's very hard not to be online. I mean, you can, but it has a cost. So any thoughts, anybody? Any takers? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really interesting question. And this interest in psychological defense that is emerging now was also something that was present in a lot of the early debates about privacy. So when in the 1960s, you know, like European jurists started meeting to discuss this, one of the things that people were really worried about was brainwashing and the use of truth serums and the use of any kind of technology, whether like a medical technology or audiovisual technology, that could somehow penetrate the human body and extract information. Like, you know, what if I can use a lie detector and I can have access to what information that you don't really want to give me? So there's this concern about who has the authority to extract information, both from the body and the mind, that was really, really present in the early debates about privacy, and then fell out after the discourse shifted to more of a focus on data processing in the 70s. And so I think in a way that's a kind of reemergence of an older concern, but in a new form where it's less about who can take from you and more about who's legitimately able to present what is true.
Yes, I mean, the struggle over, I mean, you take on a number of questions here really to do with both truth and falsity. I mean, Camilla mentioned closed Facebook groups, of which there are many kinds. And so you have the little brothers and you have the big brothers somehow who are, and we're all in this together in a way. We have another question. If there's nobody else who wants to comment on, we can let that simmer a bit, and maybe we'll return to it in a little while to Camilla's very important question. So Maya Frickman, please.
Yes, thank you. It's not really a question, but just some observations. You made me think about some matters here, and I'm not talking as a researcher here because this is definitely not my field of expertise as a scholar, but as someone who is living in Sweden now. As a researcher in Sweden, I have been very, very well concerned. I just filed in a week ago, I filed in the ethics review board application for a major project, a collaborative project that I'm going to do. And the project will, the material will be based on interviews with highly profiled intellectuals who happen to be migrants. Okay, so people who really will understand what we are doing and will be able to give informed consent. But nevertheless, there is this very intimidating and very difficult, talking about filling in the forms online. I mean, there is a specific like place in hell, you know, for those guys who do these ethical reviews. I mean, I end up feeling a few years before formal retirement, I end up feeling very anxious and very incapable of really understanding what they mean and so on. And I end up with the frustrating feeling that if I really observed what is said there, I will not be able to do the research the way I'm used to, right? So on the one hand, we might have all these issues or concerns or no concern about how the data about us are being used and where they end up and where they are stored, etc., etc. Very interesting things that I never heard of, that I learned about today. On the other hand, there is what I would like, from my very biased now and limited kind of experience with this, I would call it really a pressure on researchers. So there might be some kind of question of balance, you know, what's going on in the society and how we as scholars, as researchers, are constricted in what we are doing. So it's, I think that might be, for someone who is into these kind of things, it might be that could be an interesting track to actually try to explore. So that was just an observation. I'm like sharing my frustration with you. On the one hand, of course, it's very good that we observe ethical issues, but there might be a bit of a pressure on scholars. Maybe it comes from the fact that definitely these ethical review forms in Sweden are concerning medical research, and it's very humiliating as a social scientist to actually not have a special form made for social science research. That's another matter. But what I wanted to say is just an observation, like to the question, like who is concerned, or what are people afraid of or concerned with when it comes to technology in general. And my this is more I don't think it's anecdotal really, because I think there is a trend in Swedish schools, and I have a family member who is 11 or 12 years old, so that's the age we are talking about. They do not write by hand. They do everything on iPads. It's okay. And talking about what Alexandra was kind of her field, like the materiality of, well, this is not prosthetic, or we could metaphorically say that iPad is a prosthetics element of the 12-year-olds in Sweden. I don't know. So what happens is that the parents, who are much younger than I'm born 1960, and of course I really understand what it means to write things by hand when it comes to memorizing, getting yourself kind of a break time for understanding what you're doing and so on. I mean, to me, it's so kind of going without saying, but now there are generations of parents who are much younger who might, you know, have different ideas about this. But even parents who are 20 years younger than me are concerned, because the children are not really learning in the way that we still believe is helpful for them. And recently, I'm sorry I didn't save it, but there was a piece in one of the major Swedish newspapers. Someone is doing research saying, oh, they memorize better if they use their hands with writing. I mean, this is something which is like such common knowledge and going without saying, but now there is research in pedagogics telling us that technology might have its limited kind of benefit when it comes to schools. So this is a very much a daily practice in, I don't know how many Swedish schools, but I would say generally it's kind of a trend that they use digital technologies. And maybe there will be an end to this, or maybe, you know, the researchers that will find out things that maybe I or some people who are my age or older here understand, like is going without saying. Maybe there will be some kind of difference in the attitudes towards, well, this is maybe technology of a different kind, but still, yeah. So that was just an observation. Obviously, it's not a question, it's just an observation.
Yes. I think this is a major concern over here in Norway, what you're talking about, Maya. I mean, the way in which certain schools are now transitioning almost completely to, iPads, to tablets, basically, as a replacement for school books. And you could see this just as a move to save money, but they market it as something very different. And someone did research on handwriting, where they looked at the handwriting of sort of average, basically girls from the 1950s, from the 1980s, and from the 2010s. 1950s, 1980s, almost identical, very legible, very pretty, nice sort of round letters. 2010s, almost illegible. Scrolls, and there is something here about the hand-body, hand-brain relationship, which is fairly interesting. And I wonder, Alexandra, have you thought about this sort of thing in your research? Have you looked into this sort of thing in your research? The sort of the embodied mind thing, and the way in which technology may intervene and interrupt processes that we used to take for granted.
Absolutely. And I think also a lot of my questions surrounding the embodied mind is surrounding how we conceive of the mediation of touch and pain, and how technology enters into that very complicated relationship. So in the trials that I follow, there's an interest in understanding, well, does the prosthetic touch come to substitute for what natural touch? And so then the question is, what is natural touch? How do you describe it in language? Is your natural touch the same thing as my natural touch, or is natural touch even what the most important thing is to aspire to replace? And so then there enters questions about optimization of the human form, transcendence of the human form, and what I find in my field site is the coexistence of these questions of to what degree can these technologies mimic the human body, or to what degree is that necessary, or can you still use other parts of substitution of other parts of the human body for that effect, and then use the prosthetic for more functional, sort of pragmatic functions? Does the prosthetic have to substitute the hand? And for many patients in these trials, they are only unilateral amputees, and so they still have their other contralateral hand, and they would much prefer to use the quote unquote biological touch than the touch functions, the very raw sort of touch functions of the prosthetic hand. So yes, absolutely, those questions, and I think it's very fascinating to think about how things such as iPads are, or computers are removing us from a sort of embodied exchange with the materiality of knowledge production or whatnot.
And it may also, it's fascinating, thank you. And this question may also be framed in the context of, the Nordic, as it were, world, and the way in which we conceptualize personhood. Because I think most people, at least most of the people I know anyway, they think that the smartphone makes them more stupid because you outsource part of your brain. And if you put part of your brain into this, there will be less left in your brain. Whereas research from South Korea shows that most of the Koreans spoken to by the researchers felt the opposite. They felt that the smartphone made them smarter because they saw it more as an integral part of their body, a natural extension of their body. So I have all this information available. I can now know what the name of the capital in Belgium. I wouldn't have known without my smartphone. So I'm much smarter. So there is a more seamless integration, it seems. This is a bit speculative, but there may be something here that's worth exploring comparatively. So Kelly, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, by the way, for the wonderful conversation so far. Let me just see how I put my hand down. My question was actually for Alexandra. So you talked a little bit about the laboring body as the implicit or maybe even the explicit object of restoration when it comes to neuroprosthetics. And I find this really interesting because technology, specifically labor-saving technology, is oftentimes held up as the thing that will make the laboring body obsolescent. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on whether you see the development of these technologies in Sweden as animated, at least in part, by the desire to protect or reaffirm the viability of like a shared productivist social democratic imaginary in a hyper-technologized time. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. That's a really interesting question, Lance, very resonantly. So interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, all of the patient subjects in the neuroprosthetic trial that I worked with their hands. So a lot of the limb loss was a work-related accident. So in manufacturing or even in their home lives, in smaller villages in the north, that two of the patient subjects had an identity as the handyman or the fixer, and the sort of one that people in the village went to fix things. So this notion of working with one's hands was very endemic to identity. And so what the imaginary was for these patients surrounding receiving a limb was to return to that form of productivity. And I think that exists very interestingly with the idea that the machine is the one that's replacing the laborer, which I did not get the sense of within the context of these patients. But I think on a larger scale, there are, of course, concerns when we think about, the substitution of different technologies for human labor. But in this case, it almost seems, as you said, to reaffirm the role of the functioning body. And the focus of the trial was very much, how do we restore function so that people can return to their lives, return to the workforce. A lot of the evidence that the clinical trial put forth was about people returning to work, working full-time instead of half-time, being able to load heavy loads onto trucks. And so, but it was very much, the focus was on the individual as opposed to the machine itself doing that work. But I will think with that question in terms of a larger concern about substitution. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, are you happy, Kelly? Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have a couple of comments now in the chat channel, and one of the first one from Mette Weistrup is that I think in Denmark some groups worry about coming back after the virus, like to a whole new reality. I work in hospital administration, and everyone is worried about this. Mette, I wonder, can you elaborate a bit on this if you're here? Coming back after the virus. Will it be different? Some worry about not being able to come back because they will be forced to work from home, which will, save their employees a lot of money, office space and so on. Okay, that was a comment anyway. But we have a nice comment as well from Rasmus Rodenius, and I think you may want to say something about this as well. On the topic of technologies, what about the use of technology for fieldwork and research? I'm thinking about along the lines of the app Paula Favero has been part in creating, called Ethno Alley. So Rasmus, are you there? I can't see you, but maybe you are. Has he left the room? Okay,
hello, do you hear me?
Yeah,
sure.
But we can't see you, not yet.
I'm here without the video at the moment. The internet connection is too.
Yes, your connection is not too good. So anyway, maybe some of the panelists also have thoughts about this, the way in which we can use. What are the possibilities and limitations? I think, Paula, you've been working with the internet and with various sort of relationships between people and the internet in various parts of the world for many years. How do you see the possibilities of using internet? I know lots of people do, but what are the limitations and opportunities? What are the affordances?
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question, Rasmus, and sorry you sounded a bit garbled too, but I think you can still hear us. Yeah, of course. I also teach a course in digital anthropology, which is a master level course at our department that we've been teaching since 2008. We started among the first to do that. And this year, it was all online, and in that course, I've always given students like a project assignment to do a small project in teams. And this year they had to do project work fully online as well. So doing like a small ethnographic project online with interviews in Zoom or Skype or through WhatsApp and so on and so forth. And I think it was interesting to see how the students really appreciated it. I think they all felt quite empowered by this course, because the pandemic has also raised the question, what do you do about fieldwork if you can't travel like we're used to traveling? And then the whole idea that you can actually do online fieldwork and do very thorough fieldwork online and using various digital technologies is, of course, can be very inspiring in many ways, although of course it also has its own limitations. But I think that's an area where anthropology has been quite slow. I mean, there are some media anthropologists and digital anthropologists who've been propagating for this for years, but it's far from taken off. I mean, I've had conversations with colleagues who are like, I would refuse to do an interview online. You know, unless I can do it face to face, it doesn't count as a real interview. But at the same time, and we're having this meeting through Zoom and feel like it's a worthwhile and I think very real event. So there's a lot of, I think for younger scholars who are used to using digital media in their everyday life and who just learn some techniques for anthropological fieldwork, they seem to be quite ready to try and test things out.
Yeah, I mean, in the last year or so, we haven't had much choice, have we? At our department, we had about 50 master students who were meant to leave for fieldwork sort of in March, April last year. So we had to think very fast about other things for them to do. And some did digital fieldwork. In fact, Stefan Dalsgaard, who was part of our previous panel here on the environment, has written a really nice article about Facebook and fieldwork. But the point that he's making is that it works really well if you know people already. You know, he had been there, you know, he'd been to New Guinea and he'd spent a year there. So he knew the people and then he could continue the conversation online. So there may be some limitations. Helena.
Yes, I wanted to ask the panel if you have views on how we as anthropologists can reach different audiences through technology. Not, you know, there are different types of writings and different types of other ways through technology to get our results out to new audiences, not only academic audiences. If you can talk about that.
Great question. Maybe you should answer it yourself, but maybe anybody else who wants to comment on the possibilities that the new technologies provide for us in making it possible for us to communicate in new ways. You know, I had a chat some time ago, about a year ago, just before the lockdown. In fact, we were in West Africa somewhere with a colleague who's one of the really good writers in anthropology. And he said that now that he had a blog, he was hoping that he might be able to sell a few books via his blog, because people on the whole don't really buy books anymore. But maybe because lots of people read his blog, so maybe they could order, you know, books via the blog. I think we have a couple here. Maybe you want to comment on Helena, so maybe you have something else on your mind. We start with Jennifer Mack, who was first.
I think I see Alex's hand was up. And
I'm sorry about that. I couldn't see it. Sorry, you didn't raise your hand virtually. Go ahead.
Oh, I did. That's okay. I just wanted to say briefly. You know, I think a lot of you all will have seen these as well, but to answer Helena's question, I think that what's most exciting to me in terms of communicating ethnography is the potential to have really interactive design, right, that people can kind of meaningfully engage with, not only consume. And so a few examples of projects like that have been, Liz Miller is an anthropologist out of Concordia University who created an interactive map called Shorelines. So you can sort of move up and down a map, and then as you go into it, you can see video, you can see text, you can also sort of, you know, you can kind of be immersed in a site in a way that I think is different from reading a book. And then also the Feral Atlas project out of Aarhus in Denmark is another one that's gotten a lot of traction recently and brings together anthropologists alongside natural scientists. And it's a really kind of multidisciplinary field of collaborators who've created this really rich, immersive, kind of almost textual environment that I think is unlike anything we had, you know, even 10 years ago, and is really exciting to me.
Yeah, things are changing very fast, and I think, you know, one of the things that we should be looking for is the way in which space is also changing, you know, because places which are connected versus places which are unconnected, and how somehow some people are willing to pay for things that other people are willing to pay not to have, you know, to avoid. So maybe being offline becomes a coveted resource. Having these Caribbean island, which is not connected, becomes a symbol of being really high up in the system, but also being far down in the system in different places. Paula, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, just building on that, and also thinking a little bit more about what are people worried about. I mean, in this class I just had with our master students, they were also discussing and concerned about being online too much. The stress from being that now the expectation is that you're reachable, you know, 24/7. You're supposed to always be able to, you know, respond to emails or whatever. People are supposed to be able to be in touch with you all the time, and the stress involved of that, and that they were reflecting a lot on, and that like they spend more hours online now during the pandemic when everything is online than they normally do. And it's not just a good thing. It can also, you know, it affects your well-being positively in the sense that you can be in touch with people even though you don't physically meet, but it can also be very taxing and stressful. So I actually used to, every like end of the week seminar, encourage them to have a nice weekend and take some time offline. Just like use the privilege to have offline time.
Yes,
which
yeah.
I hope they
It's an odd effect of the pandemic, isn't it? How the outside world, the physical world, has cooled down, but the digital world has just continued. It's overheating, it's frantic, acceleration. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, but I'll give the floor to Alexandra first.
Yeah, really quickly to comment on Helena's question as well as build off of Alex. I'm really hopeful about the role of visual and video ethnography moving forward, especially in my own work. I think it does really important analytical and deconstructive work against merely reading about these technologies, because when one reads about them, one gets a very kind of cyborg imaginary about what they are, but when one sees the friction between the body and machine meeting in daily life, that can really do some important unworking of some of the textual based imaginaries.
Yeah, interesting. Yes. So we have a couple of questions. I think Jennifer, please. There you are.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this this conversation, and actually the topic that you're discussing right now is in many ways the thing that I'm really concerned about, which is the built environment. I'm an anthropologist and an architectural historian, so I'm thinking about these issues in relation to one another, and I was really interested in the way that several of the panelists talked about this kind of way of treating technology heroically in the Nordic countries, adopting these technological advances, both historically and today, but this kind of reliance on positivism that underscores all of them, but also in relation to planning and architecture, which I study, which is also something that happened in the 20th century, of course, to develop ideal housing and landscapes. But you asked, like, what are we worried about? And I was, thinking both about how these technologies seem to intersect with the way that we understand and engage with the built environment, the sort of physical built environment. Excuse me. So I'm wondering about how we do that now and how we will do that. I was thinking about something like, there's this very popular methodology in space, in urban planning called space syntax, where actually there is an idea that you can actually measure segregation, that you can decide by looking at the data how segregated an area is depending on how far away it is from other areas and how many turns you need to make to get to that place. So to me, this is sort of as positivist as it can get. So I was really interested also, I guess, or my other concern is about this question of embodied exchange and the laboring bodies. I mean, the one that Alexandra brought up, but also the laboring bodies that Kelly was talking about, or also even the question about coming back. And I mean, I take as my own example, of course, my own workplace, the university environment, but I think that this applies to many different institutions. You know, moving all of these classes online, abandoning the material workplace, abandoning the physical building. And I work at a department where they had already adapted to flex desks after they created a building that was too small for the department. And I had the feeling even before the pandemic that the leadership, you know, would love to have the students and the faculty working from home regularly. So to me, the changes in relation to COVID seem to be a kind of opportunity for these kind of neoliberal forms of downsizing and consolidation in state institutions like universities, but also others. I'm also an elected member of the faculty assembly, and I brought up, we had a session, a whole session on the digitalization of the university in the COVID era. And I brought up the issue of, you know, who's able to be online and who is not. And some of the questions that Paula was discussing about class and ethnicity and the profession were brought up, but I was met with a question from someone in the leadership of the university who is able to be physically present and who is not when the meetings are held physically. They pointed out that young children sometimes restrict one's abilities to participate in meetings that are held physically, which I can of course relate to because I have small children. So I agree that there are other questions of equality that are also raised when the physical environment is used, but I also found these kind of strange apologies for a transformation that has happened in crisis and not through planning to be somewhat disturbing. It seems predatory and opportunistic, and it worries me a lot. So I guess my two concerns are, well, they're interrelated. It's the built environment as a physical space in relation to technologies used to develop it, but also how we think about technology, its use and development in the context of crisis, as opposed to what we might call, or what is so-called normal life.
Absolutely.
So
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much. Yes, I think we have a lot to think about here. I take that mainly as a comment, but if anybody wants to say something, you can do so towards the end. But you know, I mean, I think we're in for some surprises, and luckily, I mean, that's one of the fun things about doing research, isn't it? That some of the kinds of exclusion and inclusion that we are now seeing in the digitalized world are not the ones we might have expected or thought about beforehand. I mean, a close friend of mine is severely disabled. He had an accident, okay, so he's in an electric wheelchair. To him, the pandemic has been fine, you know, because suddenly he's like everybody else. So we're in for some of these paradoxes as well, and not just a reproduction of the old inequalities, I think. Kerstin, please.
So unmuted. Unmuted. Okay, you can hear me? Good. First of all, I wanted to say that I think that this discussion is very interesting. And one point that I tagged on to really, I think is really, really nice and good to discuss is the relationship between technology and sensory experiences that I found very interesting. But what I wanted to do was to comment on mainly Paula's statement on digital ethnography and online research and these kind of things. I've been member of the Media Anthro network since 2004, and we have a lot of researchers discussing how to do research and ethnographies online. So it exists a lot of people doing that. I'm working on digital diasporas, and there is also a really big field to do research online in different forums, in Facebook, in a lot of different ways. So, I mean, that was my comment. It is really a blooming field, I think.
Yes, and obviously there are, well, as Tom Bolstoff taught us years ago, certain worlds only exist.
So,
anybody wants to make a final statement? We're running out of time. We should be done in a few minutes, but feel free to comment on anything. There are lots of questions I've got here, well, on my screen actually, not on my notepad, but on my screen that we haven't been able to talk about properly, to do with climate and to do with well-being. And I think also we touched upon some of the really important questions to do with the Nordics, what's peculiar to the Nordics, such as trust. Trust in other people, trust in government, trust in corporations, trust in technology. The assumption that if we can just get the right kind of technology, things will be fine, which is probably more widespread here than in other parts of the world for historical and other reasons. And also the flip side of trust, alienation, distrust, that sort of thing. What you do with that in a society which is now increasingly cash-free, and where you, if you hand a banknote over to the person in the shop, they will look at you with a sort of suspicious glance, because who's got cash except criminals these days? So, I can't see any raised hands right now, so maybe we'll just call it today. What do you say, Kelly and Helena, my co-organizers?
That sounds great. I think that everyone has put in a very good shift. So thank you, everybody, the panelists. Thank you, Thomas, for moderating. And thank you to our audience members for your attention and for the really wonderful questions and comments. We have another event coming up, our final event of this particular series. It's called Diversities, and it will be held, let me just double check. For those of you receiving my emails, dates and times are not my strong suit. Friday, May 21st at 1 p.m. That is British summer time. I've learned more about time zones maybe than anything else while doing this. So please join us again on May 21st at 1 p.m. London time for Diversities with Synnøve Bendiksen, Maya Fickman, Anna Hedlund, Jennifer Mack, and Helena Wolf.